Grief is not always sad, and it can look very different for each of us. It can be angry, numb, fearful, hollow, disorienting. Grief doesn't follow a timeline, and it doesn't go away. It changes shape, and when treated with respect, it can become a companion, one that deepens us rather than diminishes us. This episode is not about getting over grief. It's about making space for that inevitable human experience. Welcome to Oxygen for Educators. I'm one of your hosts, Michelle Kinder. It's our hope to bring you thought-provoking, unscripted conversations full of actionable ideas to fuel your important work in the world. Thanks for tuning in. This space is for you. Hi everyone, this is Michelle Kinder, and today in the Radical Hope series, we're taking a look at an experience that often goes unnamed or too narrowly defined or misunderstood completely, and that's grief, and also how we can hold grief without losing ourselves. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about grief related to death, but also grief about the losses that we live with every day. Loss of normalcy, of certainty, loss of confidence in systems, or loss of possibility. These losses can add up to a deep, uncomfortable sadness that runs quietly in the background of our lives and leads us to say things like, everything is fine, I just feel off, or I haven't felt like myself in a while, or even I'm going through the motions, but honestly, I don't feel much. Grief expert David Kessler, who wrote Finding Meaning, the Sixth Stage of Grief, reminds us that there is power in naming and understanding grief. He talks about how grief isn't just one emotion, but many, and how even when nothing objectively catastrophic has happened, we can still be carrying real, legitimate loss. So 3 things to keep in mind as we continue the conversation. First, grief isn't just about death. Loss of relationships, identity, roles, stability, trust, control, all of these carry grief. Second, grief is not always sad, and it can look very different for each of us. It can be angry, numb, fearful, hollow, disorienting. And third, grief doesn't follow a timeline, and it doesn't go away. It changes shape, and when treated with respect, it can become a companion, one that deepens us rather than diminishes us. This episode is not about getting over grief. It's about making space for that inevitable human experience. If grief is bigger than we've been taught, then it helps to get more specific about what kinds of grief we might be carrying. During the pandemic, Kessler named something that helped so many people exhale. He said what we were feeling wasn't just stress, it was grief. And he described a few forms of grief that often are not recognized. One is anticipatory grief, that ache in the body when the future feels uncertain, when you're bracing for something you can't yet see, when your nervous system is preparing for loss before loss has fully arrived. And guess who is best friends with anticipatory grief? Anticipatory anxiety, which is exhausting and takes a huge toll on the nervous system. Another he named is ambiguous grief, when what's lost isn't clean or clear. Maybe a relationship hasn't ended, but it has changed. Maybe your role still exists, but it doesn't feel the same. And maybe you're still doing the work, but that meaning that has always driven you feels opaque or hard to connect to. And third, he talks about grief that comes from absence of closure. When there was no ritual, no clear ending, no moment to mark what was lost, it just shifted and everyone was expected to keep going. For educators, really for anyone in deeply relational work, these complex, unrecognized aspects of grief are everywhere. It's the student you couldn't reach no matter how hard you tried. It's that policy you knew was hurting kids. The system you once trusted. The version of yourself that had more energy. Or the sense of certainty that used to anchor you. And when those losses accumulate, it doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like fatigue or irritability or numbness or that often cited sentiment, I just don't feel like myself. And sometimes the hardest grief is the kind no one recognizes, what researchers call disenfranchised grief, loss that doesn't get a ritual or a card or permission to slow down. There's no funeral for the version of you that had more energy. There's no ceremony for the loss of trust in a system. No public acknowledgement for moral exhaustion. But in our bodies and in our souls, it's grief. And sometimes when grief goes unnamed, unrecognized long enough, it starts to look like something else. Burnout or cynicism, disengagement, even shame. What gets played off as exhaustion is often actually heartbreak. And there's a term for this, moral injury. Moral injury happens when we are prevented by systems, policies, constraints, capacity from acting in alignment with our deepest values. When we know what care would look like, but we can't offer it. When we see what a child needs, but the structure won't bend. When we are asked to participate in something that conflicts with what we believe is right. That doesn't just tire us, it grieves us. Because part of what we lose in those moments is the sense that our actions reflect who we are. We lose alignment. We lose agency. We lose that feeling of integrity. And when that loss isn't acknowledged, it can turn inward and it can sound like, maybe I'm just not cut out for this. Maybe I should be stronger. Maybe it's me. But what if it's not you? What if what you're feeling is grief? Grief over the gap between your values and your environment. That kind of grief deserves acknowledgement and it deserves compassion, not self-criticism. And here's the important part. When moral injury is named as grief, it becomes something we can tend to. It becomes something we can hold instead of something that silently erodes us. There's another frame here that has helped me, especially when grief feels heavy, but also strangely clarifying. In her book, Bittersweet, Susan Cain writes about what she calls the bittersweet temperament, the understanding that joy and sorrow are forever paired, that longing and love sit right beside each other. She suggests that the ache we feel isn't a flaw in us, it's evidence that we care deeply. Longing points to what matters. The grief we carry, whether it's about a student, a system, a season of life, or a version of ourselves, reveals our values. It tells us what we hoped for, what we loved, what we believed in. And maybe the goal isn't to eliminate that ache. Maybe the invitation is to become people who can hold beauty and sorrow in the same breath. That's not resignation, it's depth. It's emotional adulthood. And in that holding, resilience can take root. Maybe part of what makes this so difficult is that we've been taught to think of grief as something to recover from, something to move through, something to finish. But Mirabai Starr writes that we are not meant to look at grief as a disease we get over, but as a sacred landscape we sometimes have to navigate. A landscape, not a checklist, not a diagnosis, not a detour, but a terrain that changes us as we move through it. When we think of grief that way, as landscape, it softens the urgency to fix it. If grief is a landscape, then the question becomes, how do we move through it without getting swept away? And this is where I often return to a framework from Dr. Dan Siegel and Dr. Tina Payne Bryson, something they call the river of well-being. They describe our inner life like a river. When we are regulated and integrated, when we can imagine ourselves flowing down the center of the river, right down the middle of the river. In that space, when we are in that integrated, regulated nervous system state, the people around us experience us as flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. It's an acronym, FACES. Flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. In the middle of the river, we're not perfectly calm. It's not endlessly positive, but we're integrated. When something difficult happens, when grief hits, we can get pushed toward one of the riverbanks. And they describe one side of the riverbank as chaos. We can present as overwhelmed, anxious, emotionally flooded, maybe having racing thoughts, tears that feel like they won't stop. On the opposite bank is rigidity, shutdown, numbness, tight control, or detachment, the I'm fine, even when we're not. Grief can push us toward either bank, chaos or rigidity. Some days it can look like spiraling, and other days it can look quiet and like we're disappearing inside ourselves. Resilience is definitely not never touching the banks. Resilience is increasing our capacity to notice when our boat is bumping up against the bank and know what it is that helps us gently steer ourselves back towards center. Not by force or pretending, but by tending to the nervous system. This is where Tina Payne Bryson's phrase becomes so powerful. Name it to tame it. When we name what is happening inside us, this is grief, or this is anticipatory anxiety, this is heartbreak, we create just enough space between us and the emotion to relate to it, rather than be defined by it or consumed by it. Naming it does not erase the feeling, but it gives us a better shot at integrating it. It moves us from chaos or rigidity back toward flexibility. And that middle channel, that river, that's where resilience expresses itself, not as toughness or denial, but as that capacity to stay connected to ourselves while we navigate increasingly difficult terrain. Elizabeth Lesser writes in her book, Broken Open, that during times of transition, even amid seemingly insurmountable adversity, life offers us a choice to turn away from change or to embrace it, to shut down or to be broken open and transformed. And I think grief is often that threshold, not a choice in the sense that we can control the loss, but a choice in how we relate to what it awakens in us. We can brace and harden, or we can allow ourselves to be changed. So the question becomes, how do we gently guide ourselves back toward the center of the river of well-being when we feel ourselves hitting the banks? Here are a few anchors that help me. The first is that emotions need motion. Grief is physical. It lives in the chest, in the throat, in the jaw, in the gut. If we try to outthink it, it tends to intensify. Sometimes the most regulating thing we can do is release our attachment to the story of our grief and just let it move out of our body through walking or sweating, shaking, breathing deeply enough to actually feel your ribs expand, speaking it to someone who's trusted, crying. And listen, we have been so misled about tears. Tara Moore writes that tears are one of the most exquisite parts of our design. It's our body's natural way of expressing and moving emotion, especially grief. Tears are not representative of weakness. They're not about a loss of control. They are a release valve, and they are evidence that something inside us still cares. The second anchor for me is paying attention to my sphere of control. When everything feels uncertain, I narrow the frame. I ask, what is actually mine to influence today? It's never the whole system, the future, the outcome. It's narrowing into what can I do today? What conversation can I have? What choice can I make? How can I return to a sense of agency by narrowing in to what is actually mine to do so that my nervous system can come back to that regulated state and my boat can come back to the middle of the river of well-being and I can show up for the people and things that I care about. The third anchor is a case for compassion. Grief can narrow our perspective. It can tell the nervous system we are under threat. And when we feel under threat, our brains default to protection, tightening, bracing, criticizing, scanning for danger. Compassion, extended to others and to ourselves, interrupts that pattern. Researchers like Kristen Neff and Paul Gilbert have shown that compassion isn't indulgence. It activates the brain's soothing system and downregulates the threat response. It reduces burnout and it increases resilience. And Martha Beck names another layer of this. She reminds us that kindness and compassion are the bridge between anxiety and creativity. When we are harsh with ourselves, the brain constricts. When we are kind, it opens. Compassion signals safety. And when we feel safe, we think more clearly. We imagine differently. We move from that state of constriction to a state of expansion, which is a far more comfortable state. What's more, grief requires creativity because navigating loss asks us to reimagine who we are becoming. Educators are often exceptionally skilled at extending compassion outward. But when navigating the complex experience of grief, compassion has to come home. This is heavy because I care. Without that recognition, grief turns into self-blame. That recognition, of course, doesn't fix the grief, but it does keep us from turning it against ourselves. The fourth and final anchor is personal. A month shy of my 21st birthday, my 24-year-old sister died suddenly of an aortic dissection. In the haze of the loss and the funeral, someone came up to me and squeezed my arms and whispered, "Now is a time for strength. Do the things that make you strong." I have no memory to this day who that was, but that sentence has shaped my life. When I feel myself drifting toward the banks of chaos or rigidity, when grief feels big or small or ambient, I remember that whisper. Now is a time for strength. Do the things that make you strong. And for me, this has allowed me to understand that strength is not about pushing through. For me, it's about coming back into my body. It means running in the mornings or going to a yoga class, spending time outside in silence or with a good book. I'm talking with other people who are equally allergic to small talk. Everyone's list is different, but over time I've learned this. In seasons of grief, I cannot wait for motivation. I have to practice steadiness on purpose. And time again, in these small intentional acts, I come back home to myself. Before we close, there's another layer we have to examine. Many of us were taught that grief follows a predictable pattern, and that if we just move through the right stages, we'll arrive at closure. And that belief shapes how we judge ourselves when grief lingers. We think, I should be further along, or I thought I was past this. Why is this still affecting me? Elizabeth Kubler-Ross herself later clarified that stages were never meant to be linear. And Dr. Ted Wyard captures the trap perfectly. He says, these are not distinct items on some grief agenda. We don't get to check them off the list, move on to the next one, and then when all the boxes are marked, we're all better. Grief is not the flu, and we don't get over it. Grief is a lifelong journey of healing into who we really are. And this is where David Kessler's work becomes especially important. Kessler, who worked closely with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, has spent decades clarifying something we often misunderstand. The stages of grief were never meant to be a checklist or a finish line. Acceptance is not the end of grief, and healing is not the disappearance of pain. In Finding Meaning, Kessler proposes a sixth dimension of grief, and it's a lifelong endeavor. It's meaning, not the kind of meaning that explains the loss away. It's not saying things like this happened for a reason or minimizing what was taken or lost. Meaning, as he describes it, is about what we choose to do with the love that remains. It's about honoring what mattered, carrying forward the values, the lessons, and the depth that grief revealed. Meaning can look like advocating for something because of what you lost. It can look like loving more intentionally or setting a boundary you wouldn't have set before. It can look like becoming softer in places that you were once rigid. Meaning does not remove the ache. Kessler is clear about that. You can have meaning and still have grief. In fact, meaning and grief often coexist. Meaning is not moving on, it is moving forward with whatever the loss is woven into who you are becoming. Contemporary grief research echoes this. Healing isn't about detaching from what we've lost. It's about finding new ways to remain in relationship with it, to carry the bond forward in a different form. You don't stop loving. You don't erase what mattered. You integrate it. And maybe that's the invitation, not to get over grief or master it, but to let it change us without turning us hard, to let it clarify what matters and reorder us quietly. Grief is not evidence that you are broken. It's evidence that something mattered deeply, that you loved, that you believed, that you stood for something. And if you are in the middle of grief, visible or invisible, may you give yourself the same steadiness that I'm certain you offer others. Resilience does not demand that we be untouched. In fact, it grows in the places that have been broken open. Thanks so much for listening, and we will see you next time. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Oxygen for Educators. Please like, share, and follow, and if inclined, leave us a 5-star review so that we can keep making content for you. Let us hear from you if you know someone we should interview or a topic we should cover.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guest and host and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any organization. The content is provided for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended as professional advice. Listeners are encouraged to use their own judgment and seek appropriate professional support when needed. Oxygen for Educators, its host, and production partners are not responsible for any actions taken based on the information shared in this podcast.